I am visiting again the former Soviet Union, giving some lectures on political and legal philosophy. In the United States, I teach at a small college in New York City called King's College. It's a small Christian college in the middle of Manhattan. And maybe the most interesting thing about King's College is that most of our classrooms are in the Empire State Building. So I teach regularly in the Empire State Building. I used to have my office in the Empire State Building, but unfortunately, I now have a new office, which is across the street. So I don't have the prestigious Empire State Building address, which I used to have. What else can I say about myself? Well, I received my doctorate degree in the United States. My specialty was political philosophy. And my degree in the United States, it's called a degree in politics. I received my master's degree and my doctorate degree from Princeton University. And I work in New York City. I teach at, as I said, at King's College, but I now live in Princeton, New Jersey, which is about 1 hour from Manhattan.
You were a teacher in one of the Russian universities?
I taught at the State University of Irkutsk. I taught there. In fact, it was 8 years ago. I received the invitation, so it was academic year 2002 to 2003. So I was there for a whole year. So I returned to the United States in July 2003, and I arrived in Irkutsk in August 2002. So it was almost a full year.
Yes, and you have a large experience, and can you compare Russian people and Americans? What is common and
what is different?
Difference.
The worldview, so I will use a Russian word here that I know, the мировоззрение of Russian people and American people, in general, it's quite different. They have different worldviews. And speaking for myself, this is one reason why I became interested in Russia. And in general, Russia and all the countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union, it's a very different worldview. I think I understand the Russian worldview better than I understand, for example, the Ukrainian worldview or the worldview of people in the Caucasus, for instance, Armenians or Georgians. I think I understand the Russian worldview better. So let me make a few comments about the Russian worldview and the American worldview. There are some similarities in that I think Russian people and American people, because Russia is part of the West, in the United States is part of the West, they want some of the same things. They understand some of the same things in similar ways. But the historical influences on the Russian people and the American people are quite different. So begin with religion. Russia historically was Orthodox Christian. And then in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, Russia was officially atheist because of the Soviet Union. In the United States, most people say that they believe in God. Most people say that they are religious. In the United States, we have many different religions. I know in Russia also there are many different religions. But I think in the United States, it's unusual for somebody to say openly that he is against religion or that he is an atheist. But in Russia, it seems to me, many people are indifferent to religion. And it is difficult to know if in Russia today maybe a religious renaissance or rebirth is taking place. We are in Western Ukraine now, and it seems to me the people in Western Ukraine are probably more religious from appearances. From what I see, these people are probably more religious than people in the big cities in Russia, for example, Moscow and St. Petersburg. So I do not know if in Russia now, if there is a religious renaissance or rebirth. So that's one important difference. I think in general, American people probably are more religious, or they believe that they are more religious. And American people, in general, they don't have such a good opinion of people who say that they are atheists or that they are against religion. What else can I say? Well, American people are very practical people, and maybe Russian people are not as practical as Americans, and maybe Russian people, they do not understand how practical Americans are. And by this I mean that most American people are middle class. The biggest class in the United States is the middle class. It seems to me in Russia today you have a small middle class. It's a growing middle class, and I think in general that's a good thing. You have some people who are extremely rich. You have some people who are very comfortable, but not extremely rich. And then you have a middle class, and it seems to me, according to the newspapers and journals that I read, that the middle class in Russia today is maybe about 10 to 20% of the population. Maybe 10 to 20%, maybe a little bit bigger in the big cities, maybe smaller in cities far away from the center. And there are, unfortunately, a lot of people who are poor in Russia today, at least in comparison with the United States. Maybe all of us need to remember that when we talk about poverty, we need to think of different countries in the world, because to be poor in Russia, it's probably not as bad as being poor in Africa. Okay? But the big difference, again, is that the middle class in the United States is very large. Most people, probably 75-80% of the people in the United States are middle class. We have poor people. We have an official level of poverty, like an official income. If you are below this income, this salary, you are considered poor. That class of people in the United States, maybe it's 15%, maybe 20%. And of course we have some very rich people in the United States, but the middle class is the biggest. So those are some important differences in my opinion.
And how do you think why Russia is not in America?
Well, it's interesting for me to think about this very big question. The 20th century, in my opinion, was not so good for Russia. And by this I mean I think that communism was not a good development for Russia. I don't think it was a good development for Ukraine. Now when I say this, I want to say immediately, I know that communism did one very good thing for the Russian people, and probably also for the Ukrainian people, but I don't know as much about Ukraine as I do Russia. By this I mean many history books in the West say that in 1917, when the Russian Revolution began, approximately 75-80% of Russian people were illiterate. They could not read. And one achievement of the Soviet state was that it increased very quickly the percentage of people who can read. So today in Russia, almost everybody can read. Almost everybody can read. Very few people, it seems to me, in Russia are illiterate. And so that, in my opinion, is the great achievement of the Soviet system. But the costs of achieving this and some of the other things that the Soviet system achieved were very high. By this I mean, during the Soviet period, in general, there was not respect for human rights. Many millions of people died during the Stalin years. The Civil War from 1918 to 1921 was terrible. And then also, after Stalin died, when Khrushchev was leader, Khrushchev was in power until 1964, and he was removed from power in 1964. In the period from 1964 until about 1985, when Gorbachev became leader, it's called, I think in Russia as well as in the United States, it's called the era of stagnation. in the Soviet history. And this, I think, was a bad period also because during the Khrushchev years, there was openness about some of the crimes of Stalin. And it seems to me from 1964 to 1985, that openness disappeared. And then it returned when Gorbachev became the leader. But 1964 to 1985, we could say there was economic stagnation, and also there was some kind of political stagnation because people did not want to discuss, the Soviet leadership did not want to discuss certain problems, including some historical problems under Stalin. And so one other way to look at this, and here I am thinking of something that the great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn said. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was going in the direction of democracy. It was going in the direction of democracy, and he admits that there were many illiterate people in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, but he says if you look at the situation in Russia after 1905, when Stolypin, Peter Stolypin was one of the leaders, Solzhenitsyn said that if those political changes had continued, and if Russia had not gone into the First World War, it could have been a very good century for the Russian people. And Solzhenitsyn, of course, he was born right after the Russian Revolution. He was born, I believe, in 1918, and he died in 2008. He was almost 90 years old when he died. And so he lived through the entire Soviet experience. He outlived, as we say. He died after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he studied very much the history of Russia at the beginning of the century before the revolution, and he said many times at the end of his life, Russia could have had a great century if Russia had not accepted communism. So that's a very interesting perspective. That's an interesting perspective, and I think about that a lot.
Do you like your country?
Yes, I like living in the United States. It's not a perfect country, but I do not believe really that any country in the world is perfect. Every country has problems. Every country that has problems, if it has a good political system, it's trying to solve those problems. But sometimes we should remember that when we solve a problem, we create a new problem with the solution. So I do not think that the United States is paradise. It's not the perfect country. And the thing that I like most about the United States is the political stability. This is very important to me. Of course, as many people know, we have a high standard of living in the United States, and I am not against that. But I think the political stability is more important than the high standard of living.
What does it mean to be American patriot?
To be an American patriot? Well, in my opinion, it means that a person who is living in the United States and who is a citizen of the United States, it's okay to say, I love this country, and I love the people, and I respect the institutions. I think the institutions are good. But to be a patriot, in my judgment, in my opinion, means that one should also think critically about many things in one's country. So, example, I think critically about American history. And when I say that the United States is not a perfect country, I mean there have been problems in American history from the beginning, very serious problems. The biggest problem in American history, in my opinion, was slavery. And this was a very serious problem that led to the American Civil War in the 19th century. And unfortunately, after slavery, relations between whites and blacks in many states, especially in the South, still were not good. So when I think about patriotism, I think about also the need, the importance of thinking critically about some things in the United States. And so I do not think, for example, that in international relations that the United States is always right, that the United States always does the correct thing or the best thing in international relations. Sometimes I support the United States when it acts in international politics, but sometimes I criticize my country. And I think it's okay to be a patriot and criticize your own country.
When you were in Russia, did you face with some negative attitude?
Toward the United States?
Yes.
Yes. Some of my students.
Americans.
Yes, some of my students, when I was teaching in Irkutsk, they told me they did not like the United States. They told me that, and then they said to me at the beginning of the academic year, well, maybe you are some kind of missionary. You want us to accept American thinking about everything. And I said, no, I'm not. I said, I don't think that the American mentality is the best mentality. I said, I came to Russia because actually I like Russian people. And Russia, after the end of communism, I think has some serious problems, and it would be good for educated people in Russia to have conversations with educated people, especially from the West. But of course, really from all countries, but especially the West, because Russia is part of the West. And Russia, the biggest country in the world, of course, some of the Russian Federation is in Asia. But even in Asia, even in Siberia, I think the mentality of Russian people, it's still more Western than Eastern. But to answer your question, yes, some of my students said directly that they don't like the United States and that they don't have such a good opinion of American people. So that was at the beginning of the year, and I am happy to say, I am glad to say that at the end of the year, the relations between these students and me were better.
Now you live in New York City.
I live outside New York City. I work in New York City. I work in I was living in Manhattan for 2 years, and in some ways it's a great city, but it's a very big city, and it's noisy, and it's in some parts a little dirty, and it's not me. I prefer an academic town, an academic environment, which is why now I live in Princeton. But I like New York. I just don't want to live there. It's pleasant for me to work in New York, and when I finish my teaching, sometimes my students and I, we will do something in Manhattan. We will go to see a film together. Maybe we will have a pizza together. Maybe we go to see a play together. So there are many cultural activities in New York that are very good for students and teachers at a college or university. Someone like me who's teaching at a college in Manhattan.
And how do you think, why New York is so attractive city for a lot of people from all over the world?
Because it has energy that I do not know if there's a city in the West that has as much energy as New York. And what do I mean by this? I mean, well, in the United States we say New York never sleeps. It's the city that never sleeps. And literally this is true. You know, the subway in New York, it goes 24 hours a day. And I am not sure this is a good idea. You know, I think everybody should rest a little bit, even the people that work on the subway. But the mentality of New York is everything goes 24 hours a day. Like the city goes 24 hours a day. Of course, most businesses, most firms, they close in the early evening or the late afternoon, and people go home. And most people in New York live a normal life, but the energy of the city is associated with, it's linked to the fact that there are many things in the city that continue all during the night. New York is also the commercial center of the United States. There's no doubt about this. It's the commercial center of the United States, and that's part of its energy, and it's also the cultural center of the United States. It's not. There's a difference. It's not the entertainment center of the United States. Hollywood is the entertainment center, but New York is the cultural center. Like the high culture in the United States comes from New York. The best theaters, most of the best writers live in New York or near New York. The best artists, all the good artists in New York, all the good artists in the United States, it seems to me, they want to be in New York. They want to be in New York. New York is more important than Los Angeles or Chicago or San Francisco. If you are an artist, you want to be in New York.
David, do you mind, what is a human right and what is a human dignity?
Human right and human dignity.
Yes.
Those are very big questions. Those are very big questions. Well, generally, when we talk about a human right, generally we talk about a protected liberty, something that is guaranteed, that has a special status, and it's a status that every man and woman has against public authority. And some human rights are described as negative, and some are described as positive. But negative human rights or positive human rights, both of them are important. So, for example, a very important human right is the right to vote in elections. If a person does not have this right, then politically it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. The best way, in my opinion, to have a good political system is to have regular elections in which all of the men and women can vote. So that's not a negative right. The right to vote, it's like a positive right. A negative right is when we say that the government cannot censor literature, for example, or the government cannot force people to be religious. So there is freedom of religion. It's a private choice. It's a protected liberty. That's my understanding of a human right. And human rights are related to some idea of human dignity. If we ask the question, why do people have human rights? It seems to me we must talk at least a little bit about human dignity. We must talk a little bit about human dignity. And when we talk about rights and human dignity, we mean that human beings have dignity that they cannot completely lose. Let me explain just a little bit. Human dignity, even if a person commits a crime, we believe in the West that that person still has some dignity. For example, if a person commits a crime and many people see the person commit the crime, the person is still entitled to a fair trial. A fair trial, because that's something that is required by human dignity. It's a requirement of justice related to the idea of human rights and human dignity.
Thank you very much, David.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm happy to try to answer your questions, and it was good to talk with you.
I was so happy to have an interview with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Very good.